For Module 3, we are going to look at documentation requirements for the PIA process. Personnel compensation payments or staff transactions are those made to employees and include salary payments, FICA, and fringe benefits such as health insurance and workers' compensation. AmeriCorps requires evidence to support the employee's compensation amount and a completion of a criminal history check. For these transactions, please provide a statement identifying the type of compensation in addition to the following, starting with the start date. This may or may not be the start date for the current position. If there was a break in service or employment greater than 180 days, the date the staff member returned to employment must be used. There are many forms of acceptable documentation to show the start date, including a signed employment contract, a screenshot from your HR system, or a personnel form indicating the start date. Please note for NSCHC, if your organization used AmeriCorps approved vendors TrueScreen and/or FieldPrint, we can pull the individual's file from our system using the case number for TrueScreen and the TCN number for FieldPrint. Now, for a budgeted position, this is typically shown by providing the approved grant budget with the employee's position highlighted or indicated in some manner. If the employee's title does not match the title in the budget, please clarify the alignment to the budget in some way. For salary payments and fringe benefits that are based on salary like FICA, LTD, or workman's comp, we need pay stubs for the pay periods covered by the selected payment, annual or hourly salary information that was in effect at the time of the selected payment, and any documentations such as personnel action forms or labor distribution reports that explain how the amount charged to AmeriCorps was calculated and allocated to the grant. Please note, if the selected transaction is a fringe benefit such as health insurance, life insurance, or workman's compensation, we need the policy from the provider that documents the workers' comp rate or the org share of the health or life insurance premium. Regarding timesheets, if the employees work for an organization such as a university or a local government that is not required to keep timesheets in compliance with 2 CFR, please provide a statement indicating this, and we will confirm this requirement is not applicable. However, if the employee does not work 100% on the grant, we do still need documentation supporting the amount charged for the grant. The primary issue we see with staffing transactions are related to time and effort and inability to recalculate transaction amounts or calculation errors. If an individual works on multiple awards, their time spent on each award must be tracked. Fringe benefits and taxes related to salary are included in this category, and we will need policy documents or statements to confirm the payment amounts are correct. You only need to provide support for fringe benefits if it was selected for testing. Living allowance payments, including payments for health insurance, taxes, and fringe benefits to AmeriCorps members, are the regular stipend payments in accordance with the schedule laid out in the member agreement. AmeriCorps requires documentation that the member was eligible to serve. For AmeriCorps members' eligibility requirements, please refer to 45 CFR 2522.200. For AmeriCorps member payments, we will need the following, starting with documentation showing the date the member began service. This can be shown by providing a signed member agreement or a screenshot from the portal showing the start date. Next, we need documentation showing proof of age. Members must be at least 17 years of age when they begin service. Copies of a U.S. passport, a birth certificate, government-issued ID, etc. can all be used to show proof of age. After that, we need to see documentation that shows the member has a high school diploma or its equivalent. If the member agreement requires the individual to certify this requirement, the signed member agreement is acceptable documentation. Screenshots from the application in the portal are also acceptable. We also need to see documentation that shows the member is a citizen, national, or lawful permanent resident alien of the United States. If citizenship was verified by the Social Security Administration in the member portal, a screenshot of that verification is acceptable. If it was manually verified in the portal, please provide additional documentation. Next, don't forget we need documentation related to criminal history checks, such as the NSOPW, the state and FBI checks, and then of course, we need documentation confirming the amount of the stipend paid to the member. For this, please provide a signed member agreement along with a payroll register or pay stubs to support the amount of stipend pay. AmeriCorps checks that the member was paid according to the MSA. If for some reason the entire stipend amount is not charged to AmeriCorps, please clarify how the AmeriCorps share is determined. And finally, we need time and activity reports compliant with grant provisions and terms and conditions, demonstrating the member was in service during the period covered by the transaction. We don't see a lot of non-CHC member noncompliance. Outside of CHC, where we see the most AmeriCorps member noncompliance is around the living allowance calculation. The member service agreement should be updated and the member should be informed if conditions of the contract change. For example, if the living allowance amount or the term of service is updated. AmeriCorps Senior transactions include stipend payments made to AmeriCorps Senior volunteers based on their hours served. Please note that meals and mileage reimbursements are considered other transaction types and are actually tested under different criteria, which we will discuss in a little bit. AmeriCorps requires documentation to verify that a volunteer was eligible to receive a stipend. For more information on FGP eligibility requirements, please refer to 45 CFR 2552.41. For each volunteer that is selected, please provide documentation showing the date the volunteer began service, such as the volunteer's first timesheet or confirmation from the program when the volunteer began, and documentation showing proof of age. This is because volunteers must be 55 years of age or older to serve. Copies of a U.S. passport, birth certificate, a government-issued ID, etc., can all be used to show proof of age. Next, please provide documentation that shows proof of income eligibility. Please note the income eligibility determination must have been completed before, but not more than a year prior to, the service dates covered by the transaction. Don't forget documentation related to criminal history checks and timesheets showing hours served during the selected pay period. Finally, please provide a payroll register or pay stubs to support the amount that was paid to the volunteer. Some AmeriCorps Senior noncompliance themes relate to the income eligibility form or lack of policy for PTOs such as holiday or personal leave. Please note that the income eligibility form must cover the service dates. This means the income eligibility form must be reviewed by a program official before the service date, but not more than a year prior to, as this is an annual requirement. The last transaction type is other transactions. These are expenses for other program operating costs such as payments to contractors, rent or utilities, staff travel meal reimbursements, recognition costs, supplies and equipment, mileage and meal stipends, training costs, and administrative or indirect costs. Documentation supporting the costs must demonstrate that it was appropriately authorized and payment was based on an invoice or agreement. To support other transaction types, we will need a description of how the cost conforms to the approved grant budget, proof of costs such as the receipt, contract, policy, or invoice for the expense, and proof of payment, which is required for all costs except indirect and administrative costs. You need to demonstrate the item purchased was paid for. This is generally done by providing a check stub, bank statement, or receipt of payment notice. Please be mindful that an expense paid for with a credit card does not show proof of payment. We need to see that the credit card expense was paid off. So the next billing statement showing the selected expense was paid off will suffice. Finally, if applicable, we need to see the basis of allocation. This is actually the most common item we go back to for other transactions. If you have an expense and the cost of this item was shared across grants, programs, or cost categories, we need to know what that basis of allocation was based on. Was it staffing or square footage, etc.? We also need to see the calculation because we need to be able to recalculate the expense to include the applied allocations. Please note, if the payment is for mileage or long distance travel, we will need the mileage form and any applicable travel authorizations. And finally, if the payment is for an indirect or admin cost, we need the basis for the rate, such as the federally approved indirect cost rate agreement, budget per AmeriCorps fixed percentage, de minimis rate, etc. We also need the direct cost amount the rate was applied to and the calculation of the indirect or administrative costs available for the selected period. Here are some common non-compliance themes we see with other transaction types. The most common non-compliance theme we see with other transactions, as mentioned previously, pertains to the basis of allocation. The basis of allocation is required for any charge that is split between multiple programs, including multiple AmeriCorps programs. So for example, if you split a charge between SCP and FGP. To support the amounts charged, we require the math behind the percentages being applied, meaning if it's a 10% charge based upon square footage, we will need the calculation of the square footage that supports that 10% figure. Another common issue is if an expense was initially charged on a credit card, we will need proof the credit card was paid to show there were federal funds involved in the transaction. Finally, for costs that are related to indirect, admin, or the de minimis rate, please do not provide traditional proof of cost and proof of payment. We only need confirmation of the rate being used through a rate agreement or a budget showing you're opting to charge de minimis and a listing of direct charges for which the rate may be charged against. We will then show that the transaction amount selected was within the amount available to be claimed as indirect or admin. Now we will briefly review documentation requirements for National Service Criminal History Checks. The agency has separate trainings for NSCHC and Litmus. More information on NSCHC requirements can also be found on AmeriCorps' website. NSCHC is required for staff, AmeriCorps members, and AmeriCorps volunteer transaction types. To support NSCHC, we will need background information including the start date and a covered position, if there was a break in service or work greater than 180 days, and if the state of residence was the same as the state of service at the time of application. We will then need the NSOPW, National Public Sex Offender website search, the state of service check, and the state of resident check if applicable, and an FBI check. Furthermore, if your program used a waiver, please provide the approved waiver. Finally, please submit name verification documentation such as the government ID or the I-9. Some other notes, if you participated in TrueScreen, you simply need to provide the case number. Similarly, with FieldPrint, you simply need to provide the TCN. If one or both NSCHC components were conducted outside TrueScreen or FieldPrint, you need to provide the results unless your organization has an approved waiver. After testing is completed, we provide the testing results to our stats team. They extrapolate the identified improper payments over the entire program population per our approved sampling methodology. The extrapolation, just like the FFR selection process, is program specific. Each program will have its own improper payment rate that is reported to the Office of Management and Budget. For those interested, we have included the formula that our stats team utilizes to conduct their extrapolation. The formula includes the project dollar amount in error, the dollar amount in error for the sample FFR, the probability of selecting the FFR, as well as the dollar amount of the FFR and FFR population.